Vivian Hale arrived at the hospital at 4 in the morning. She had flown back from a business trip the moment she got the call her mother, Margaret, had been admitted after a stroke. The hallway outside the room was empty. No nurses, no monitors being checked. When she pushed open the door, the room was dim and silent, and a man in a gray janitor's uniform was slumped in a chair beside her mother's bed. His head bowed, like he had been there for hours. Vivian stood in the doorway and felt something cold move through her chest. In one of the most expensive hospitals in the city, why was a janitor the only one in that room? She did not move right away. Vivian stood in the doorway of room 414 and studied the man the way she studied a contract, looking for the part that didn't belong. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and something warmer underneath, like coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Her mother lay still in the bed, chest rising and falling in slow, even intervals. The monitors blinked green. Everything appeared stable. And yet the only other person in that room was a man in a gray uniform, with a mop handle leaning against the wall behind him. Vivian stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind her. She moved to her mother's side first, checking the monitors the way she had learned to after years of watching Margaret be admitted and discharged from various hospitals. Blood pressure reading oxygen level, heart rate, all within acceptable range. Then she looked at the man again. He hadn't stirred. His chin was tipped toward his chest, his breathing slow, one hand draped over the bed rail with the kind of settled weight that only comes from hours in one position. His name badge read, C. Ward Environmental Services. Vivian reached over and gripped his shoulder. The man snapped awake immediately, his hand pulling back from the rail as he straightened in the chair. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of face that was unremarkable until it was alert. Dark eyes clearing fast, jaw tight, already scanning the room before he had even fully registered where he was. When his gaze landed on Vivian, he stood up, not because she intimidated him. She noticed, but because standing was simply what he did when someone walked in. "You're her daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. Vivian kept her voice flat. "Where is the nurse assigned to this room?" The man Ward ran a hand over the back of his neck and glanced toward the door as if checking whether anyone had followed her in. "There was a mass casualty event about 3 hours ago," he said. "A highway accident, multiple vehicles. The ER got overwhelmed. They pulled staff from the upper floors to assist." He looked back at Vivian steadily. "There's no one officially assigned to this hall right now. I've been checking in on her since around 1. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. In her professional life, she had developed a particular sensitivity to the gap between what people said and what they actually meant. She had built a career reading that gap in boardrooms and negotiations, in rooms full of people who wanted something from her. She looked at Caleb Ward now and tried to find the angle, the motivation, the part he wasn't saying. She found nothing obvious, and that made her more suspicious, not less. "You've been in this room since 1 in the morning, she said. "In and out," he said. "I checked on her every 20 minutes or so. Sat here the last hour because her breathing got a little irregular around 3, and I didn't want to leave her alone." Vivian's eyes moved to the bed rail, where his hand had been resting when she walked in. There was a notepad on the chair beside him, small, spiral-bound, the kind sold at drugstores for $2. She picked it up before he could say anything. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, times written neatly in the left margin. Next to each time, a brief notation, BP cuff stable, breathing regular, no distress, restless repositioned pillow, breathing irregular, elevated slightly. Monitored 10 minutes returned to baseline. The entries ran from 1:12 in the morning all the way to 3:47. Vivian set the notepad back down. She looked at Caleb Ward and felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't trust. It was closer to the feeling she got when a variable she hadn't accounted for appeared in a model she thought was complete. "You're a janitor," she said. "Yes." "This isn't your job." Caleb Ward looked at her without flinching. "No," he said, simply. "It isn't." That was all he offered. No justification, no elaboration, no performance of humility designed to make her feel something. Just the flat acknowledgement of a fact, and then silence. Vivian found that more disarming than any explanation he could have given. She was accustomed to people who filled silence with words when they needed something. Caleb Ward filled silence with nothing. She turned back to her mother. Margaret Hale was 71 years old, and even in sleep she carried herself with a certain composed dignity, the posture of a woman who had raised a daughter alone and made it look like a deliberate choice. The stroke had been described to Vivian as mild over the phone, the word mild delivered with the careful reassurance of a doctor managing expectations. Vivian had sat with that word on a plane for 4 hours and still didn't know what to do with it. Now, standing in the room watching her mother breathe, she was aware of how much she had been relying on the assumption that someone was here. Someone trained, someone responsible, someone who was supposed to be. Instead, there had been this man. Vivian pulled her phone from her coat pocket and stepped toward the door. "I'm going to speak to hospital administration," she said. "You can go back to your work." Caleb picked up his notepad from the chair and tucked it into his breast pocket. He moved toward the door, and she expected him to leave without another word. Instead, he stopped near the monitor on the left side of the bed and pointed to one of the readings without touching anything. Her blood pressure dropped to 89/54 around 2:30, he said. "It came back up on its own, but whoever you talk to, make sure they know that happened. It's not in the official log because there wasn't anyone to log it." He looked at her once evenly, and then walked out. Vivian stood in the room alone with her mother and listened to the soft rhythm of the monitors. She looked at the chair where Caleb had been sitting, the imprint of hours in a hard hospital chair, a spiral notepad full of handwritten observations, and a blood pressure reading that should have been documented and wasn't. She thought about what might have happened if the pressure had dropped and kept dropping, and there had been no one in that room at all. The thought didn't finish cleanly. She pushed it aside. She took off her coat and folded it over the arm of the chair, then sat down beside her mother's bed and held Margaret's hand. It was warm. She focused on that, the warmth of her mother's hand, the steadiness of the monitors, the pale blue light coming through the window from the parking structure across the street. She did not think about the janitor. She told herself she did not think about him. But when the floor administrator arrived 20 minutes later, looking harried and apologetic in equal measure, Vivian heard herself relay the 230 blood pressure drop before she had consciously decided to. She watched the administrator's face go carefully neutral, the expression of someone absorbing information they'd have preferred not to receive, and she thought about the notepad with the handwritten times and the man who had taken it with him when he left. She had come to this hospital expecting to find systems in place, protocols being followed, the expensive infrastructure of competent care operating exactly as it should. She had paid for that. She paid for it annually through her mother's premium insurance coverage, through the hospital's donor relations events she attended and wrote checks at without complaint. She had paid, and she had trusted, and she had been on a plane when her mother's blood pressure dropped to 89/54, with no nurse in the room and no entry in the official log. The only record of that moment existed in a $2 notepad in the breast pocket of a man who mopped floors for a living and had stayed in that chair because apparently no one else was going to. Vivian thanked the administrator and asked her to send someone to cover the room for the rest of the night. Then she sat back down beside Margaret and tried to decide what she actually thought about Caleb Ward. She landed on the same 2 words she always landed on when something didn't fit her model. Not yet, she thought. She didn't know enough yet. But the notepad stayed in her mind. The entries, the times, the careful, unhurried handwriting of someone who had decided to pay attention when it wasn't required of him. That stayed with her long after the administrator left, and the hallway outside went quiet again. The morning shift arrived at 6:15, and with it came a different kind of chaos, quieter than the night before, but no less damaging. A charge nurse named Sandra appeared in room 414 with a tablet and a tightly professional expression, introducing herself to Vivian and beginning a review of Margaret's overnight chart. The review took less than 4 minutes before Sandra's expression shifted from professional to carefully controlled. Several standard monitoring entries were missing. The 230 blood pressure reading Vivian had reported to the floor administrator was not in the system. The notation fields for the hours between midnight and 5 were either blank or filled with entries that had clearly been copied forward from the previous shift without individual timestamps. Vivian watched Sandra scroll through the chart and did not say anything. She had already understood the shape of the problem before the nurse confirmed it. What she had not understood until now was the full scope of it, that her mother had spent the most medically vulnerable hours of her admission essentially unmonitored on paper, that the official record of her overnight care was nearly fictional, and that the only accurate account of what had actually happened existed in a spiral notepad currently in the possession of a man who was probably somewhere in this building mopping a floor. Sandra closed the tablet and looked up. "I want to be transparent with you, Miss Hale. The overnight gaps are a documentation issue, and we take that seriously. I'll be escalating this to the department director this morning." Her voice was measured the language of institutional damage control, shaped by training and legal caution. "We're going to do a full review of your mother's status now, and make sure she's properly covered going forward." Vivian thanked her in the way she thanked people when she intended to follow up without mercy. When Sandra left, Vivian sat with her mother for a while and thought about what the word documentation issue was designed to smooth over. She was familiar with the technique she had used it herself in business contexts, the strategic reframing of a failure as a process problem. It was cleaner. It moved the conversation away from accountability and toward procedure. She had always found it effective. Hearing it applied to her mother's hospital care made her understand, in a way she hadn't before, exactly what it felt like to be on the other side of it. She went looking for Caleb Ward at 8 in the morning. It took her 20 minutes. She found him on the 3rd floor, running a floor buffer down a corridor near the radiology wing. He cut the machine when he saw her coming, and there was nothing in his face that suggested he had been expecting her, only the same unhurried attention he'd had in the early morning hours, the kind that cost him nothing and gave away less. Vivian got to the point. "The overnight chart has significant gaps. Your notepad has the only accurate record of her vitals during those hours. I need a copy of those entries." Caleb reached into his breast pocket and handed her the notepad directly. "You can keep it," he said. She took it. She looked at the entries again in the hallway, light cleaner, now more legible than they had seemed at 4 in the morning. The handwriting was precise and consistent, every time stamp written in the same unhurried print. She noticed for the first time that the notation abbreviations he had used, BPO, SAT RR, were not guesses. They were accurate clinical shorthand. "Where did you learn to read these monitors?" she asked. Caleb picked up a cloth from the cart beside him and wiped down the handle of the buffer without particular urgency. "My mother was sick for about 3 years before she passed," he said. "I did a lot of hospital nights. You learn what to watch for." Vivian looked at him. There was no performance in the statement, no bid for sympathy, no meaningful eye contact held a beat too long. He said it the way someone says a fact that belongs to them and no longer has sharp edges because it happened a long time ago, and they have already decided how to carry it. She asked him one more question because it was the one she couldn't answer herself. "Last night, when you said her breathing was irregular, around 3, what exactly did you observe?" Caleb described it with the same flat precision he used for everything. The rhythm had become shallow and uneven, with occasional skips of about 1 to 2 seconds. It had lasted roughly 8 minutes before stabilizing. He had stayed close during that window, had been ready to call for help. But the pattern had returned to baseline before he felt it crossed into emergency territory. He had noted the time and continued monitoring. Vivian listened and understood 2 things simultaneously. The first was that his observation matched exactly the kind of presentation that could precede a secondary vascular event in a patient with Margaret's profile. The second was that most people, even many trained family members, would not have recognized it, would not have known it from ordinary sleep breathing, and would not have stayed. She returned to her mother's room without giving Caleb anything more than a nod, but the ground had shifted under her model of the situation, and she knew it. Margaret was awake when Vivian came back. She was sitting up slightly against the pillows, looking more like herself. Alert, slightly imperious, the particular expression she wore when she wanted information and was prepared to wait for it. Vivian told her what she needed to know in the most condensed version possible: mild stroke. Stable overnight monitoring, ongoing. Margaret absorbed this with the composure of a woman who had outlived a difficult marriage and 2 economic recessions, and regarded most new crises with a certain baseline skepticism. "Was there a man here earlier?" Margaret asked. "Dark hair. Sat with me." Vivian confirmed it. Margaret looked toward the window. "He talked to me for a little while," she said. "Around 2, I think. I wasn't fully awake, but I remember his voice." She didn't elaborate. She simply noted it the way she noted things she found worth keeping. Vivian did not ask what he had said. She wasn't sure she wanted to know yet. The crisis arrived at 11:14. Vivian was on a call in the hallway outside the room when the monitor alarm sounded a single sustained tone that was different in pitch from the standard alerts she had been hearing all morning. She ended the call without explanation and pushed through the door. The monitor was displaying a blood pressure reading of 82/49 and descending. Margaret was awake and conscious, but visibly uncomfortable, her color shifting, her hands gripping the blanket at her sides. Vivian hit the call button, then hit it again. The hallway intercom crackled, and a voice told her someone would be there shortly. She looked at her mother's face and understood that shortly was not a unit of time she could work with right now. She was already moving into the hallway to physically find someone when she nearly walked into Caleb Ward, who was coming around the corner from the service corridor with a cleaning cart. He read her face before she said a word. "What floor is her doctor on?" he asked. "I don't know." "The call button." Caleb moved past her and into the room. He went directly to the monitor, checked the reading, then moved to Margaret's side. He did not touch the IV or the equipment. What he did was straightforward and deliberate. He elevated the foot of the bed, using the manual crank at the base, raising Margaret's legs above heart level. Then he turned to Vivian. "Get someone from the nursing station, the one on this floor, not the intercom. Go now." Vivian went. She was back with a nurse in under 2 minutes. By the time the nurse reached Margaret's bedside, the reading had climbed to 91/58 and was continuing upward. The nurse checked the chart, checked the patient, and began the proper response protocol, calling for the attending physician, adjusting the IV rate, running a new set of vitals. Margaret's blood pressure stabilized at 102/64 within the next 12 minutes. Throughout all of it, Caleb stood near the door. He had moved there the moment the nurse arrived, removing himself from the center of the room, without being asked, shifting into the position of someone who was simply present and not involved. Vivian noticed it. She noticed the exact moment he stepped back, and she noticed the nurse's quick glance in his direction. The flicker of recognition, the slight narrowing that came from seeing a gray uniform where a gray uniform should not be. When the doctor arrived, and the room filled with the purposeful energy of people doing their jobs, Caleb quietly left. Vivian stayed. She watched her mother's color return, watched the numbers on the monitor settle into a range that meant safety, and felt something she had been holding in her chest since 4 that morning begin to release by degrees. She sat down in the chair beside the bed, the same chair she had found Caleb asleep in, and realized that for the second time in one morning, a situation had resolved itself, partly because of that man. She found the head of nursing staff at noon. The conversation was brief and did not go well. Vivian laid out the sequence of events precisely, the undocumented vitals, the notepad entries, the 2 instances of blood pressure crisis, and Caleb Ward's role in both. The nursing director listened with the careful attention of someone who understood that she was speaking with a donor and a very angry family member simultaneously. When Vivian finished, the director thanked her, confirmed that everything would be reviewed, and said, with genuine visible discomfort, that an environmental services employee intervening in patient care even informally constituted a breach of hospital protocol that would need to be addressed. Vivian asked what that meant. The director told her that Caleb Ward had been placed on administrative suspension pending review of the overnight incident. The report had already been filed by a senior nurse who had learned of the situation through the floor administrator's escalation from the night before. The suspension was a standard procedural response, she explained. It was not a punitive measure, but a process. It would be reviewed. Vivian understood the difference between what those words meant and what they were doing, and the 2 things were not the same. She left the director's office and stood in the hallway for a moment, working through what she had just been told. A man had spent an entire night watching her mother's vitals when no staff were available to do it. He had identified an irregular breathing event at 3 a.m. He had elevated the bed frame when her blood pressure collapsed and bought the 12 minutes it took for a proper response to arrive. He had done all of this outside the boundaries of his job description, and the institutional response to that was to suspend him. The logic was procedurally consistent and humanly intolerable, and Vivian knew enough about systems to understand that both things could be true at the same time. She went to find him. He was in the basement level near the service lockers turning in his equipment for the duration of the suspension. He had already been informed. He was handling it with the same absence of performance that defined everything else about him efficiently, without commentary. When Vivian appeared in the doorway, he looked up but did not seem surprised. She asked him something she had been waiting to ask since the 3rd-floor corridor. You said you gave up other work to take care of your mother when she was sick. What kind of work? Caleb closed the locker and turned to face her. Paramedic training, he said. I was 2 semesters from certification. Vivian absorbed that without showing anything on her face, which took more effort than she wanted to admit. He had been 2 semesters from a certification that would have given him every legitimate credential to do exactly what he had done last night. He had walked away from it to sit beside someone who was dying and needed a person in the room, and he had never gone back. And now he was standing in a basement service corridor, turning in a key card, because the institution that had failed her mother was doing what institutions do when a variable doesn't fit the protocol. She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze evenly, without asking her for anything. Do not go anywhere, she said. I'll be in contact. She did not wait for his response. She turned and walked back toward the elevator, already composing in her mind the exact order of conversations she was going to have, and with whom, and in what sequence. She had built companies from worse starting positions than this. She had walked into rooms where every person present had already decided the outcome and changed it anyway. She knew how to do that. What she had not known until this morning was what it felt like to have a reason that had nothing to do with revenue. She stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the 5th floor, and for the first time since she had landed at the airport the night before, she felt completely clear about what she was going to do next. The 5th floor housed hospital administration, and Vivian had been in enough institutional offices to know that the people who ran them were not her actual obstacle. The obstacle was always the same, regardless of industry, a system that had calcified around its own procedures until it could no longer distinguish between protecting patients and protecting itself. She had navigated that kind of structure before. The difference was that this time she was not there to close a deal. She was there to dismantle an excuse. She started with the hospital's chief medical officer, a man named Dr. Franklin, whom she reached through the administrative assistant with the combination of calm certainty and implied consequence that she had spent 20 years perfecting. The meeting was not scheduled. It happened anyway, within the hour. Vivian laid out the full sequence of events on his conference table, the way she presented a development proposal clearly in order, with documentation. She had the notepad. She had the timestamps from her own phone showing when she had contacted the floor administrator about the 230 blood pressure drop. She had Margaret's official chart, which she had requested a copy of that morning, and which contained the gaps Sandra had identified. She placed all of it in front of Dr. Franklin and walked him through it without editorializing, because she did not need to editorialize. The facts were doing enough work on their own. Dr. Franklin was a careful man. He listened without interrupting, which she respected. When she finished, he sat back and acknowledged what she had laid out in measured terms: the staffing failure, the documentation gaps, the genuine inadequacy of the overnight coverage, given what had occurred. He was less comfortable when she moved to Caleb Ward. He intervened twice, Vivian said, once by monitoring a patient through the night when no staff were available to do it, and once by a direct physical action that stabilized her blood pressure while the call response was still in process. Both interventions are documented, one by his own hand and one by the attending nurse's report. He is currently suspended for those actions. Dr. Franklin chose his words with the precision of someone who understood liability. The protocol issue is a genuine concern, he said. An untrained employee. Vivian stopped him there. He was 2 semesters from paramedic certification before he left training to care for a dying family member. The action he took elevating the foot of the bed during a hypotensive episode is a textbook first response for that presentation. He did not guess. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he stayed within the boundaries of what was appropriate, given that no one else was present to do it. The room held the weight of that for a moment. She continued. I'm not asking you to pretend there isn't a protocol question. I'm asking you to answer a different question first, without his presence last night. And again this morning. What is the realistic probability that my mother would have survived 2 blood pressure crises with no monitoring, no documentation, and no staff in the room? She let that sit. Answer that honestly, and then tell me whether suspension is the appropriate institutional response. Dr. Franklin looked at the notepad on the table. He looked at the chart. He was a physician before he was an administrator, and the physician in him was not able to look at those 2 documents side by side and arrive at a comfortable conclusion. He told her he would convene a formal review of the incident by end of day, and that the suspension would be placed on hold pending that review. He also told her with the slightly pained candor of a man who knew he was already losing the larger argument, that the overnight staffing failure was going to require a structural response, not just an internal memo. Vivian told him she expected to be informed of the review's findings directly, and that she would be providing a formal written account of the events as a patient family member. Then she thanked him and left. The formal review concluded 3 days later, while Margaret was still in the hospital completing her recovery. The findings were released internally, but Vivian received a summary call from Dr. Franklin himself. The review board had determined that Caleb Ward's actions during the overnight period and during the 11:14 incident were consistent with reasonable emergency response, given the documented absence of available staff. The suspension was lifted. A formal commendation was entered into his personnel file, the first, the administrator noted, with some awkwardness, that the Environmental Services Department had received through the medical review process. The hospital also announced the following week a revision to its overnight staffing protocol, a minimum coverage requirement for all patient floors during mass casualty diversions, a designated check-in responsibility assigned to a senior staff member every 30 minutes for stable patients, and a new escalation pathway for non-medical staff to request emergency coverage without going through the standard call system. The changes were attributed in the internal communications to a review prompted by a critical incident. No one named Caleb Ward in the announcement. Vivian made a phone call and ensured that changed before the revision was published on the hospital's staff portal. His name appeared in the final version as the individual whose actions had identified the gap the new protocol was designed to close. She went to find him the morning the suspension was formally lifted. He was back on the third floor back with the floor buffer, running it along the same corridor where she had come looking for him 4 days earlier. He cut the machine when she appeared, and she noticed that the gesture was becoming a kind of punctuation between them, the cutting of the engine, the attention given freely, the absence of performance. Vivian told him the outcome of the review. She told him about the commendation and the protocol changes. She watched his face as she spoke and found nothing in it that resembled vindication or relief, only the quiet attention of someone receiving information they had not been certain would arrive. When she finished, he said, "Thank you." 2 words, direct and without ornament, which was exactly what she had come to expect from him. She told him there was one more thing.
She had spoken with the hospital's director of education and training about a partnership she intended to fund a support program for frontline non-clinical staff, covering tuition assistance for medical certification programs, emergency skills, training, and crisis compensation for staff who remained on shift during events like the one that had occurred.
The initial funding commitment was $250,000, with a renewable annual grant structure tied to measurable outcomes. The program was being named in honor of no one in particular. She had decided it should be institutional rather than personal, because it was a systems problem, and the fix needed to belong to the system. Caleb listened to all of this with his hands resting on the buffer handle, his expression unchanged. When she finished, he asked one question. "Will it actually help the people who are already working here?" Vivian said that was the only version of it she was willing to fund. He nodded once. That was enough for him. She almost left it there. She was already turning when she thought of one more thing, something Margaret had said 2 mornings ago from the hospital bed, while Vivian was helping her with her breakfast tray. Her mother had looked up at her and said without particular segue that she remembered the man's voice from the middle of the night, that he had told her a story about his mother, something small, something about a garden, and that she had fallen back asleep halfway through, but that it had helped. It helped to have someone talking, Margaret had said, in the way she said things she meant completely, but didn't intend to examine. Vivian had not known what to do with that at the time. She understood now that she didn't need to do anything with it. She just needed to let it be what it was. A man who had stayed through the night, not because he was trained or compensated or required to, but because he understood that a person alone in a hospital room at 2 a.m. needed to hear a human voice. She turned back to face him. "My mother wants to thank you herself," she said. "She's being discharged tomorrow. If you're on shift, she'd like to say goodbye." Caleb said he would be on shift until 3 p.m. The following day, Margaret Hale was discharged at 11:30. She was steady on her feet, dressed in her own clothes, carrying herself with the deliberate composure that was simply how she moved through the world. Vivian walked with her to the elevator, and Margaret insisted on stopping at the 3rd floor before going to the lobby. They found Caleb in the corridor near the nurse's station. Margaret shook his hand, the way she shook hands firmly with full attention, and said something to him in a low voice that Vivian, standing 2 feet away, could not quite hear. Whatever it was, Caleb's expression shifted in a way that Vivian had not seen before. Not a smile exactly, but something that moved through his face, like the surface of still water when something lands on it. They did not exchange anything more. Margaret released his hand and continued toward the elevator. Vivian followed, and as the elevator doors closed, she looked back through the narrowing gap and saw Caleb standing in the corridor, watching them go, already reaching for the buffer handle. She faced forward as the elevator descended. She was not the same person who had walked into room 414 at 4 in the morning 3 days ago. She was not dramatically different either. She had not undergone the kind of transformation that announces itself, but something had been corrected in her. Something that had been running on a flawed assumption for a long time had been brought into alignment with a more accurate understanding of how things actually worked, of what actually held things together in the moments when every formal system failed simultaneously. It was not money. It was not protocol. It was the specific, unremarkable decision of a person who chose to stay when staying was not required of them. She had spent her career rewarding competence. She understood now that she had been measuring competence with the wrong instrument. What Caleb Ward had demonstrated was not a skill. It was a quality, the kind that doesn't appear on a resume or a certification record, the kind that only becomes visible when the room is dark and no one is watching, and there is no benefit to remaining. He had remained anyway, and because he had, her mother was walking out of this building under her own power. Some debts could not be retired with a check, and Vivian was clear-eyed enough to know that. But she could build something that meant the next person who stayed would not have to pay for it with their job. That at least she could do. That at least was within her power. She held on to that thought as the elevator reached the lobby and the doors opened into the ordinary morning light.